Tochana, thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone. I really want to express my appreciation to MP Jenny Leong and all of you for hosting me here, and especially to the organizers, my friend Tempa and Yishi from SFT, and also all the support from Kinzom and Gunjam and many others here. I should, for the hospitality and for the welcome, for the warmth. So I really appreciate all of your kindness on being here. And I want to say I've never really been to any place that's so far away, and also really beautiful. I think whoever put together this continent or this country purposely put it so far away from the rest of civilization and made it really one of the most beautiful places on the planet. And on my way here from New York, on a very long flight, I was looking at the flight map, the flight route they show you, and I was trying to think about how Australia is connected to the issue of Tibet. What has Australia got to do with Tibet? And it made me realize how Australia is probably the country where there is the largest population of former Tibetan political prisoners, of prisoners of conscience. And I know among in the audience here, in this room, most of the Tibetans who are here are former political prisoners. And I'm also moved to see some of our Chinese friends here who are also exiles from China, who are struggling for democracy, including Mr. Chen Yongling and others over there. Thank you very much for coming out and showing us your support. So I want to say a couple of words in Tibetan first to my fellow Tibetans, very quickly, if that's okay. Pewat samala tuchena ani tashtile shueng rwa. Tandanganzo pepe tabzu di ta tuzu samjik tang waina tuzu kale khabo jik nang yoba dauchi rwa. Ta zara lana ta digme du tuzu zara de khadu yine pepe tabzu de zara yin barwa. Yine kabre kale khaga daw de tuzu yong de dwa. Tinde ki kable yin du tuzu bala ngaranzo lega kari chewa yine ya chi rewa di mala wa chi di kechin bure sam gudwa. Ani de de tuzu bala de pe wala ning ta wane tuje shue yin ani mixegi lenge so nam june ta chi ngomane pe nang lo ne ta chi nyam nyong da tabzu dige di chepsi gi lega mangbo ji chen dus pe de nge yin du sam bala ni mixu kane lenge so ta chi le dang da ji yor wa sem shu de nga pe masive jesu ira shue yin ro. And so one thing that I would like to open with is also, there is a lot of terrible news we hear from Tibet all the time. And all of our friends of Tibet also you made the terrible mistake of supporting the Tibetan issue. So you get a lot of bad news at the same time as we do. But recently, in the last couple of days, there was one positive piece of news that came out, which is our friend Gunjam. His sister was released from prison after 3 years sentence. Right? So I would like to take this moment to welcome Gunjam's sister. So Gunjam Kauda. Yeah. So I just wanted to acknowledge that, and the way Tibetans inside Tibet in his village welcomed her. We saw some of those pictures, and if you go on Facebook and other social media, you will see those pictures. Basically, the way people treat political prisoners and prisoners of conscience in Tibet right now is very different from back in the 90s, for example. People are not afraid to show their welcome to the released prisoners. And the number of people who turn up and the way they celebrate, they lay out red carpet for them, with huge, basically, so much applause and appreciation for what they have done. And I think it really was a huge reminder for me in terms of how far the Tibetan struggle has come. Because right now, when we look at things from a very materialistic perspective, we know most of the variables or the measurables are on the side of China. You have, economic growth, military power, political capital. Most of these things are on the side of China. But there are certain things, human forces that are hard to measure. And those pictures that showed how people were welcoming Gunjam's sister, newly released, that really shows the Tibetan spirit, just the power of the spirit. And they have no fear. People are just not afraid anymore of the Chinese government. And I think that's a really key turning point for any movement. When a people who have been oppressed, they lose their fear of the oppressor. That's a really important moment where the struggle changes and the balance of power also shifts. And one thing I wanted to point out, or basically express my appreciation to this country, is actually for hosting so many prisoners of conscience here in this country. Because by giving safe haven to political exiles and by giving safe haven to people who risked their lives for freedom, and many people who actually spent the best part of their life in prison for values such as freedom and human rights, by showing this support, I think we are sending a really strong message to the rest of the world. I think it's one of the best things we can do to promote human rights around the world, to promote freedom. And these are the people like Bogyabala here spent 22 years. 24 years in prison. 24 years, right? And those were the best, the prime of his youth, the best part of somebody's life. And the same can be said for many other Tibetans. But they paid this price so that the struggle would continue. And they made this sacrifice so that we would carry on the struggle. And the fact that they can find a safe haven in this country is actually a very special thing for me as well, personally, as a Tibetan. So I want to take this moment to thank the government as well as people of this country for making this really unique decision, because these are the people who have guarded the embers of resistance or the embers of freedom. Because movement goes through many different phases. It's like when you go surfing over here, it's like a wave, right? And during high tide, there is a lot of people who will support a movement. There are so many people who will participate and join the movement. But during low tide in a struggle, during that kind of phase, when things are depressing, fewer people are interested in joining. Most people hesitate to join or support such a struggle. And right now, during this kind of period in the Tibetan struggle, when the struggle was in those difficult phases, these are the people who have guarded the embers of freedom and the embers of resistance. And that's the only reason why we have such a thing as a Tibet issue in today's world right now. Otherwise, the issue would have been dead a long time ago. So, I don't want to say too much about the monograph because it's better to read it, But one thing I want to point out is also to temper your expectations, because non-violence or non-violent resistance for the Tibetan people is not necessarily a new thing. So I'm not saying anything new in this book. Tibetans have used non-violent resistance for a very long time. And since the 1960s and 70s, when Tibetans started using nonviolent struggle, the approach was a little bit different from today. It was a more principled kind of approach. And the focus was more on the discipline, maintaining nonviolent discipline. Whereas today, I think we are beginning to see more of a focus on, like Kinzom said, using nonviolent resistance not only as a discipline, moral discipline, but also as a strategic instrument to promote freedom. And I think this combination of these two approaches is actually very important, because in the 70s, in the 80s, and in the 90s also, Tibetans were using nonviolent resistance and many different nonviolent tactics. And back then, we probably did not have specific names for many of these tactics. And sometimes these nonviolent tactics that people were using were not necessarily recognized by themselves as nonviolent tactics. People were just going about their daily lives doing what they thought was the right thing to do. But through the lens of strategic nonviolence, those tactics are actually very powerful nonviolent tactics. And one of the major changes that I tried to talk about in this monograph, one of the main reasons why I wanted to write this, was to pay tribute to the nonviolent methods that people have used in Tibet over the last 30, 40 years. But these tactics and these strategies are not often talked about in an academic way. And it's hard to find any kind of literature on how Tibetans have used nonviolent resistance. If you look up how Tibetans used armed resistance in the 50s and 60s, you will find a lot of resources and materials, but not so on the nonviolent front. While in reality, Tibetans have used much more, shown much more commitment to nonviolent resistance since the 80s. And even now, in spite of the way in which people have resisted, in spite of using nonviolent resistance, the response from the Chinese government has actually been very violent. The response has been brutal. And we saw that in the 80s, in the 90s, and we also saw that in 2008 during the uprising. And we have people here who participated in the 2008 uprising as well. And after the uprising, when the Chinese government started the massive crackdown and started putting